Craig Mokhiber, welcome to UpFront. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's just start here. Last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu threatened to open the gates of hell on Gaza. Since then, Israel has cut off electricity supply in Gaza. It has blocked vital supplies and goods. In fact, Human Rights Watch describes this as a flagrant violation of international human rights law. Amnesty International also added its voice, saying that this is further evidence of Israel's genocide against Palestinians. What's your take on these latest developments?
Well, I think that's right. I think it's this is the sound of impunity that we're hearing, because when you have a state that openly declares its violations of international law, including collective punishment of this kind, that is a government that does not fear being held accountable. And I think we have to say that Israel never really ceased fire, and it certainly didn't cease genocide during these weeks of the so-called ceasefire. It merely redirected the bulk of its military assaults to the West Bank, where it has murdered hundreds since the so-called ceasefire was called, in what is the largest and most brutal assault on the West Bank since Israel invaded in 1967. And importantly, it has continued to obstruct much of the humanitarian aid destined to Gaza. Even before these announcements of the cutoff of aid and of electricity, it was blocking food and medical supplies and tents, mobile homes and other essentials throughout this period. So, there hasn't really been a ceasefire as such. There certainly hasn't been an end to the genocide. These are crimes under international law.
Yet, despite everything else that you've said, President Donald Trump has threatened to take over Gaza and own it. But interestingly, the Biden administration offered some diplomatic, military and economic cover for Israel, ensuring that Israel is shielded from accountability. In comes Donald Trump. He doesn't make any pretenses of respecting international law. The Biden administration offered this cover whilst claiming to respect international law. Is there a shift between the previous administration and this one?
Well, to be sure, Trump is very bad. He's now actually arresting people in the United States simply for criticizing an oppressive foreign regime, Israel, because it's committing genocide and apartheid. Witness the case of Mahmoud Khalil, very much in the news now. And while much has been made of Trump's compelling Israel to accept a temporary ceasefire in January, its direct talks with Hamas and so on, there is no evidence of any fundamental change in U.S. policy vis-a-vis Palestine, because this didn't start with Trump. Biden and Trump and all of their predecessors since the 1940s have been equally beholden to this policy position of the Israel lobby and the project of colonization of Palestine. This capture of U.S. foreign policy is not something that belongs to the Republicans. It is bipartisan, and it is being manifest now as it was under Biden. We have to recall that in Biden's term, he didn't overturn any of Trump's misdeeds regarding the Middle East, the so-called Abraham Accords ruse, the Jerusalem embassy move, the annexation of the Golan, the eviction of the Palestinian ambassador. So this is a threat to all of us. It didn't start under Trump. It didn't even start under Biden. The key elements of this policy have continued throughout all administrations most recently.
So we can say that is the U.S. foreign policy, to just gravitate towards Israel. Let's just talk about the United Nations and how it reacted to this. The Secretary General of the United Nations spoke about this proposed forced displacement of Palestinians, saying that if that were to happen, it would be akin to ethnic cleansing. Now, these are very strong words that under normal circumstances should really force all of humanity to just reflect and act. But it seems as if these are just words, nothing more. What power does the UN have to intervene?
Well, of course, the only mechanism in the United Nations that has enforcement power is the Security Council. And I think if you look at the role that the United States has played in the Security Council, both with regard to Palestine and with regard to Ukraine, that reveals everything you need to know. Because the main role of the U.S. in the conflicts, both in Ukraine and Palestine, is not as a mediator or as a conflict resolver, which is the role of the Security Council, but the U.S. is in fact a party to both of those conflicts, not just through the provision of arms and diplomatic cover, but it is a direct party in a myriad of ways. In Palestine, despite its performative announcements and so on, it has remained committed to supporting Israel in the destruction of the Palestinians. And that's why the U.S. approach in Palestine is to obstruct UN efforts, to block the Security Council and the broader UN to keep them out of the process effectively so that it can declare itself as the sole mediator, decision maker, ensuring impunity for Israel. But I think when you're talking about the UN, you have to ask which UN. It's true that the Security Council is completely stripped of any power in this case. But the UN can do a lot, and it has been doing a lot. If you look at the independent human rights monitors of the UN, like Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, the commissions of inquiry, the independent treaty bodies, the humanitarian agencies have been doing a lot, although they too have been stifled by Israel and the US as its sponsor to a degree that we've never seen before. And it's true that the Secretary General has made some strong statements, but the senior political leadership from the Secretary General down to the heads of agencies have been significantly cowed by the US and Western allies into what is really relative inaction and taking refuge behind a kind of safe language about conflict and so on. And none of them have taken a strong stand on legal accountability for Israeli perpetrators. And in the meantime, despite all of the pandering of senior UN officials to the US has only increased its attacks on the United Nations, very significantly so under the Trump administration.
Just talking about those attacks on the United Nations, we know that there is a case of genocide that was brought by South Africa at the International Court of Justice. The ICC issued arrest warrants. It's important to mention that the warrants were against Hamas, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, for crimes against humanity. I mean, you've just highlighted all the challenges and ways in which the United Nations Security Council and the UN are failing in this regard. But is there reason for some hope, at least, that some institutions are working at getting this accountability?
Well, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice have been working toward accountability and have made historic moves in that direction through the advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice, through the trial of Israel for genocide in the International Court of Justice, and through the arrest warrants issued for Israel's leaders at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, including extermination. This is historic. But of course, the US has been working on its project of Israeli impunity double time these days. The Trump administration has already attacked the International Criminal Court, by the way, which is a crime under international law, equivalent to obstructing justice, over which the International Criminal Court itself has jurisdiction and could prosecute US officials and Israeli officials for its obstruction of justice. Trump administration in the meantime has been attacking the UN as well. It's rejected the Sustainable Development Goals. It's quit the Human Rights Council. It's rejected the authority of the International Court of Justice. It's withdrawn from UNESCO and the World Health Organization, from the Paris Climate Agreement. It's launched also similarly unlawful attacks on UNRWA, the main humanitarian agency working with Palestinian refugees in the occupied territories. It's basically renounced the Refugee Convention. You know, the US has played a very obstructive role in many international fora, opposing most of the international human rights agenda at the UN, and has been really principally responsible for some of the most toxic aspects of the Western group of states.
Yet the US, just going to other UN bodies, the US has walked out of the UN Human Rights Council, followed by Israel and Nicaragua. I mean, should we be concerned about a possible domino effect where states and countries that are disagreeing with multilateral institutions just walk out? After all, the US has opened that door.
Well, most countries recognize that they need the UN more than the UN needs them. I don't think you're going to see a cascade of a large number of countries following the US out the door. You will see some rogue regimes in particular who will see this as an opportunity, but we're seeing the opposite effect, I think, more broadly. You know, the unipolar moment is over. The US is increasingly isolated on the international stage, as it is in the Security Council. US power is eroding. Its power and influence over other states is not the same, and other states are growing in influence. We're seeing outside the UN, multilateralism is growing. And I think most importantly, you're seeing a growing embrace of multilateral institutions like the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the UN human rights mechanisms, by global civil society that are demanding that these entities, not that they cease to exist, but that they function, and that they function more in a more principled and effective way. And you know, the US has pulled out of UN bodies before. Those departures never last more than a few years before the US joins again. I think that it's important that people look at history and not fall for the trick of US threats in these areas.
Yet you resigned over failures of the UN. I mean, is the UN becoming less relevant, less effective? I suspect that citizens in war-torn countries want the UN to do much more. If the UN fails, what is the alternative?
Well, my critique was never of the UN, of the idea of the UN, or of the UN Charter, and certainly not of its principles and purposes, or the many people who are doing important, essential work at the UN. My critique was of the UN leadership, which was so frightened by Western power that it abandoned the very mandate, the very principles and purposes of the organization out of fear, leaving masses of people to suffer the consequences of that. But I believe in the UN, as millions of people around the world do. I just think that we have to defend its purposes and its principles and stand up at these challenging moments to defend what the organization is supposed to be about. And that takes also some creativity. As I said, the General Assembly needs to step up in ways that it has never done before if it's going to defend what is at stake here, which is the very idea of the UN, which is the idea of multilateralism and of the international legal system. And that means that what they're defending is human rights, peace, public health, the global climate, things that are existential to the world in which we live. And I certainly defend that.
Craig Mokhiber, thank you for joining us on Upfront.
Thanks for having me.